Why do the biggest bubbles in history always look harmless right before they explode? It is a question that has echoed across centuries, from the Dutch tulip frenzy to the dot-com mania, and yet here we are again in 2025, watching the same pattern unfold across gold, oil, and the tech markets as if the past never left us. Every major economic collapse begins with the same illusion, a collective belief that this time is different, that prices will rise forever, that fundamentals no longer matter, because innovation or global demand or monetary policy has rewritten the rules of reality. But beneath the surface, every bubble carries a hidden fracture, a point where optimism turns into overvaluation, and overvaluation turns into danger. And right now, those fractures are widening faster than most people realize. Look at gold, reaching levels that reflect not just fear, but desperation. Look at oil, swinging violently between scarcity narratives and geopolitical shocks. Look at tech, where valuations have detached from earnings in a way eerily similar to the late 1990s. All of them moving together, all of them inflating under the same pressure, cheap money, speculative capital, and a global system stretched far beyond stability. These aren't isolated events. They are converging signals inside a broader seven-stage collapse pattern that has already repeated across multiple empires and economic systems. And what should unsettle you is that gold, oil, and tech have simultaneously advanced into stage 5, the phase where confidence begins to crack, where insiders quietly pull back while the public continues to pile in, unaware that the ground beneath them is shifting. You might feel it already, the uncertainty in the markets, the strange disconnect between record prices and weakening fundamentals, the quiet sense that something is off, even though the headlines insist everything is fine. And that tension, that gap between narrative and reality, is exactly where every major collapse begins to accelerate. You've probably seen moments like this before without realizing it, moments when the world gives subtle warnings that most people choose to ignore because the truth feels too uncomfortable to confront. But ignoring the pattern has never stopped it. It has only made the impact worse when the correction arrives. If you have ever sensed that markets move in cycles far deeper than what analysts on television admit, or wondered why the same crises seem to return with new names and new faces, share your thoughts in the comments. Understanding this content matters more than ever, so make sure to leave a like and check if you are already subscribed, because what comes next in this sequence may change the way you see the global economy, and we are only beginning to uncover it as we move into the next layer of this pattern, where the signals become harder to deny and the consequences harder to escape. If you look closely at every major financial bubble in history, you'll notice something unsettling. They rarely appear dangerous in the beginning. In fact, they usually begin with logic, a reasonable idea, a technological breakthrough, a geopolitical shift, a commodity shortage, something that seems rational enough to justify rising prices. That is how all bubbles are born, not from madness, but from a seed of truth that slowly becomes distorted as money flows in and confidence surges. The formation of a bubble is never obvious while it's happening, because it grows inside the blind spots of the system, inside the assumptions that people accept without question. And right now, those same assumptions are driving global markets toward a level of risk that most investors can't see. Cheap capital is always the first accelerant. When interest rates fall and liquidity floods the system, investors start searching for higher returns, pushing money into assets that once seemed too risky or too speculative. At first, the inflow looks harmless. Prices rise gradually. Analysts justify the increases with narratives that sound reasonable enough, but the danger begins when those narratives detach from reality and optimism transforms into belief. In every bubble, there comes a moment when people stop asking whether something is overvalued and start asking how high it can go. That shift in mindset is the true beginning of the bubble, the psychological pivot where fundamentals take a back seat to collective expectation. Speculation then becomes self-reinforcing. Early gains attract new investors. New investors push prices even higher. Higher prices attract media attention, which brings in even more capital. Suddenly, the asset is no longer valued for its real utility, but for the expectation of future buyers willing to pay more. This is the mechanism that inflated railroad stocks in the 1800s, dot-com companies in the 1990s, housing markets in the 2000s, and now gold, oil, and technology in the 2020s. The cycle repeats because human behavior repeats. Fear and greed are constants, and when global markets are flooded with liquidity, greed tends to dominate the narrative. And while most people believe bubbles are caused by irrational traders or reckless investors, the truth is far more structural. Bubbles are engineered by the very incentives built into the global financial system. Central banks push liquidity, governments chase growth at any cost, corporations seek endless expansion, investors respond to pressure for higher returns. These forces combine into a machine that naturally amplifies any asset gaining momentum. Once that machine starts running, it becomes almost impossible to stop until the bubble swells to a point where internal stress begins to show, often unnoticed by the people caught inside it. As the pattern unfolds, the early signals are subtle, hidden beneath layers of optimism, media hype, and institutional confidence. But they are there, in the growing disconnect between price and productivity, in the quiet warnings from insiders, and in the uncomfortable truth that every cycle built on endless expansion eventually reaches a threshold where the system can no longer sustain its own momentum, setting the stage for the transition into the next phase of the collapse pattern. The expansion phase of every major bubble follows a rhythm so consistent that it feels almost scripted, as if markets themselves are acting out a pattern they cannot escape. Once early optimism takes hold, the system begins feeding on momentum, drawing in capital through channels that grow wider with every price increase. Investors who were once cautious start convincing themselves that the trend is not only sustainable, but unstoppable. They begin to believe that even if prices seem stretched, they will stretch further because that is what the market has been doing. This psychological shift is subtle at first, almost invisible, but it is the fuel that drives the cycle into its most dangerous phase. During expansion, liquidity becomes a weapon. Easy credit, speculative leverage, and institutional chasing of returns create an environment where money moves faster than fundamentals can keep up. Corporations issue debt to buy back shares, amplifying earnings per share without real growth. Traders borrow heavily to maximize exposure, assuming they can exit before any downturn. Technology platforms, commodities, and financial assets are all pulled into the same gravitational force, rising not because of intrinsic strength, but because capital must find a home, and rising markets are the most attractive destination. This is how expansions transform from healthy growth into a structural imbalance that no one acknowledges until it's too late. Media narratives intensify the cycle even more, because once prices begin climbing at a pace that catches public attention, every outlet tries to explain the movement in a way that validates the optimism. Analysts craft stories about new paradigms, permanent demand shifts, or technological revolutions that seem persuasive enough to silence doubt. These narratives serve a purpose. They give investors emotional permission to ignore warning signs and embrace the enthusiasm sweeping the market. With each headline, each viral prediction, each expert interview, the bubble inflates further, not because the underlying assets are transforming, but because belief in their future keeps strengthening. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is how rational it feels while it is happening. People see friends making money, they see charts moving upward, they see influential voices reinforcing the idea that this time really is different. Doubt feels irrational, caution feels outdated, and in that environment, even seasoned investors start behaving like speculators, convinced that they can time the market because the trend appears too powerful to resist. This collective confidence creates the illusion of stability, but beneath it lies an increasingly fragile ecosystem built on assumptions that cannot hold indefinitely. As expansion accelerates, the market stops rewarding fundamentals and starts rewarding participation. The simple act of being in the game becomes more important than what the game is actually worth. This is when valuations detach completely, when price movements are driven by the expectation of further gains rather than any measure of intrinsic value. And although everything still appears stable on the surface, the internal pressure is building, quietly pushing the system toward the point where enthusiasm can no longer sustain the weight of the expectations it has created. That is when the transition toward the next stage begins to take shape, hidden at first, but growing with each new surge of speculative energy. The transition into Stage 5 rarely announces itself with dramatic crashes or obvious market turmoil. Instead, it emerges quietly, almost imperceptibly, through subtle distortions that most people instinctively dismiss because the broader narrative still feels bullish. This is the moment when insiders begin adjusting their positions, when liquidity shifts towards safer assets, when valuations stop rising in a straight line and start wobbling beneath the surface. Stage 5 is not defined by collapse, it is defined by the first cracks in the illusion, the slow erosion of confidence that precedes the storm. You can sense this phase long before charts reveal it. It shows up in unusual volatility on otherwise calm days, in small but persistent outflows from major funds, in corporate earnings that no longer justify their market prices. Companies begin issuing optimistic guidance that sounds strangely disconnected from their actual performance. Analysts soften their language, avoiding direct warnings while hinting at cooling momentum or unexpected headwinds. These coded signals appear harmless to casual observers, but they are the early tremors that reveal the structural weakness forming underneath. What makes Stage 5 especially dangerous is how normal everything still seems. Markets may hit new highs even as the underlying support weakens. Investors cheer short-lived rebounds without noticing that each rally requires more effort and delivers less conviction. The psychology of the crowd shifts from genuine belief to a forced optimism, a quiet unwillingness to accept that the momentum that once felt unstoppable is now slowing down. This cognitive dissonance is the hallmark of Stage 5. People sense the danger, but admitting it feels like betrayal to the narrative they've relied on for years. This phase also introduces a subtle change in behavior among financial institutions. Banks tighten lending standards, even if only slightly. Hedge funds rotate portfolios into defensive sectors. Sovereign wealth funds rebalance away from risk-heavy positions. None of these actions are loud enough to cause panic, but together they signal a growing awareness that the expansion has reached unsustainable territory. The public remains unaware because the surface still looks calm, but beneath it, the energy that drove the bubble upward has begun to reverse direction. Stage 5 always carries a unique tension, a sense that something is shifting, even if no one can yet define what it is. You see it in commodity markets, when prices begin diverging from historical correlations. You see it in tech, when valuations flatten despite increased media hype. You see it in gold, when demand surges for reasons analysts struggle to explain. These inconsistencies are not random. They are the system quietly preparing for the transition toward instability. The signals rarely appear dramatic, but once they begin, they do not stop. They accumulate, layer by layer, forming the psychological and structural foundation for the next transformation in the collapse pattern. As Stage 5 takes shape beneath the surface, the three pillars driving today's super bubbles begin revealing how deeply intertwined they truly are. Gold, oil, and technology are often treated as separate markets, each with its own logic and narrative, but in reality they form a synchronized triangle of global speculation. Their movements reflect not just investor sentiment, but the structural pressures inside the world economy, pressures that intensify when a system is nearing its breaking point. These markets don't rise together by coincidence. They rise together because they are responding to the same underlying distortions, the same excess liquidity, and the same mounting instability that signals the world is entering a new phase of financial fragility. Gold becomes the first alarm bell. Historically, it surges when trust falters, when debt levels become unsustainable, when investors sense that currencies are weakening beneath the weight of endless expansion. But what makes the current moment different is that gold isn't rising because of panic alone. It's rising because the global economy is increasingly built on assets that require constant belief to function. The more stretched valuations in tech become, and the more volatile energy markets grow, the more gold acts like a mirror reflecting the anxiety no one wants to admit publicly. Its price doesn't just indicate demand, it reveals a shift in the psychological foundation of the system. Oil tells a different but equally revealing story. In past cycles, oil prices mirrored supply and demand with relative consistency. But today, they swing violently for reasons that extend far beyond simple consumption patterns. Geopolitical tensions, production cuts, strategic reserves, and shifts in global alliances all feed into a market that behaves less like a commodity and more like a pressure gauge for global instability. When bubbles in other sectors expand too quickly, oil becomes a counterweight, absorbing and amplifying the tensions created by speculative capital trying to predict the next move. The volatility is no longer a reaction, it is a symptom of deeper structural fragility. And then there is technology, the engine of modern speculation. Tech valuations have inflated on a scale that mirrors the most extreme periods in financial history, not because every company is transforming the world, but because liquidity has nowhere else to go. Artificial intelligence, cloud infrastructure, semiconductor dominance, each narrative contains truth, but the scale of investment far exceeds the pace of real economic output. When tech becomes the center of global expectation, it also becomes the most vulnerable to rapid contraction. The higher the belief climbs, the more fragile the system becomes, creating an imbalance that only grows wider as the bubble approaches critical mass. Together, gold, oil, and tech create a triad that reveals far more than individual charts can show. Their simultaneous rise is a sign that the system is expanding beyond its natural limits, driven not by productivity but by the cyclical mechanics of speculation. Each market reinforces the other, feeding a loop of confidence and anxiety that accelerates the transition toward the next phase. And as these forces converge, the structure supporting the global economy becomes increasingly sensitive to shocks, setting the stage for the deeper instability waiting beyond this point. When a bubble finally reaches the point where momentum can no longer sustain it, the shift toward collapse does not begin with a dramatic crash. It begins with a subtle reversal in the internal mechanics of the market, a quiet weakening of the forces that once pushed prices upward with unstoppable strength. This moment is often invisible to the public because the external indicators still appear strong or even euphoric. Markets may still be hitting highs, analysts may still insist that fundamentals are solid, headlines may continue celebrating growth. But beneath that thin surface, the internal architecture is already unraveling piece by piece. The mechanics of a collapse start with liquidity. During the expansion phase, liquidity acts like fuel poured into a fire, energizing every upward movement. But once confidence begins to fade, that same liquidity becomes unstable. It pulls back faster than it arrived. Investors who once rushed in begin asking different questions, not about how high prices can go, but about how quickly they can exit without getting caught in the stampede. This shift in behavior, even before it becomes visible, destabilizes the entire structure. Markets built on momentum cannot survive without constant reinforcement, and the moment that reinforcement weakens, gravity begins doing the work. Then comes the tightening of credit, usually subtle at first. Lenders become more cautious, margins shrink, risk models are recalibrated. These small shifts ripple through the system, reducing the leverage that kept valuations inflated. Corporations that depended on cheap debt to sustain operations suddenly face higher costs, and their earnings projections grow less convincing. The cycle of confidence, which once felt so natural and inevitable, begins losing energy, replaced by a quiet unease that spreads through institutional layers long before retail investors notice anything is wrong. As liquidity dries and credit tightens, volatility increases. Not the kind of sharp crashes that end cycles, but erratic movements that reveal how unstable the ecosystem has become. Price swings widen, markets react disproportionately to minor news. Correlations break down. The once predictable patterns that investors trusted begin shifting unpredictably, causing confusion and amplifying uncertainty. This volatility is not the collapse itself. It is the shadow of the collapse, a warning that the system can no longer absorb stress the way it once did. But the most critical part of the collapse mechanism lies in the psychological tipping point that follows. Once investors collectively recognize that stability is no longer guaranteed, even if they don't say it aloud, behavior changes rapidly. Defensive positioning replaces aggression. Short-term caution replaces long-term optimism. And as the psychological foundation crumbles, the structural collapse accelerates. The market, which once behaved like a single upward-moving organism, now fractures into competing impulses: fear, doubt, urgency, retreat. By the time these forces become visible to the public, the collapse is already well underway. Charts begin to show the downward shift, but the real break happened earlier, hidden beneath the optimism that dominated the final stages of the bubble. What follows next is not merely a price correction, it is the unraveling of a system that required near-perfect confidence to function. And once that confidence is gone, the mechanics of decline grow stronger than the forces that once drove the market upward, pulling the entire structure into the next phase of the pattern. When Stage 5 fully unravels, and the system slips deeper into instability, the consequences begin radiating far beyond the financial charts that first signaled the shift. Markets may be the earliest indicators, but they are never the only victims. What follows is a chain reaction that spreads through societies, governments, and global power structures with a speed that often catches entire nations off guard. Stage 7 of the pattern is not defined solely by economic decline. It is defined by the social, political, and geopolitical fractures that emerge when confidence collapses and the illusion of stability dissolves. The first signs appear in the social fabric. As markets contract and liquidity vanishes, households feel the pressure almost immediately. Jobs tied to speculative growth disappear, savings evaporate, retirements shrink. People who once felt secure begin confronting a reality that seems to shift beneath their feet. The middle class, the anchor of any stable society, absorbs the initial shock, and The stress reverberates through families, communities, and local economies. Anxiety rises, consumption slows, and the psychological optimism that fueled the expansion is replaced with frustration, doubt, and anger. At the same time, political systems begin to strain. Governments, already burdened with high debt levels and fragile budgets, struggle to respond effectively. They face pressure to stabilize markets, protect citizens, and maintain public confidence, yet their tools are blunt and often insufficient. Policymakers attempt stimulus packages, emergency interventions, or regulatory adjustments, but these measures rarely restore trust. Instead, they expose the limits of governmental power in a system far larger than any administration can control. Political polarization intensifies as leaders search for someone to blame: foreign rivals, previous administrations, corporations, or even citizens themselves. This political fracturing opens the door to movements that thrive in moments of uncertainty. Extremist groups gain followers, populist leaders rise, narratives that once sounded unrealistic suddenly appear convincing to a public desperate for answers. Just as past empires experienced, crisis becomes fertile ground for radical transformation. Institutions that once seemed immovable, financial regulators, legislative bodies, even central banks, lose the authority they relied on to maintain order. Globally, Stage 7 triggers a geopolitical shift. Nations with fragile economies or high dependency on foreign capital experience turbulence first. Their currencies weaken, their markets destabilize, their political systems falter. Meanwhile, stronger nations seize the opportunity to expand influence, negotiate new trade terms, or reshape alliances. Competition intensifies, conflicts, economic or territorial, become more likely. The international landscape becomes a battleground of shifting power, where countries attempt to reposition themselves before the full impact of the collapse settles. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is the simultaneous unraveling of multiple layers of stability. Economic contraction feeds social unrest. Social unrest fuels political extremism. Political extremism destabilizes geopolitical relationships. Each layer amplifies the next, turning localized issues into global consequences. And all of it traces back to the same fragile foundation that began cracking long before the public recognized the danger. As the global system enters deeper instability, the forces accelerating the collapse are rarely the ones most people expect. It is not only reckless traders or panicked investors that push the cycle toward failure. It is the coordinated actions of the largest and most influential institutions in the world. Central banks, sovereign wealth funds, major financial institutions, and highly leveraged corporate giants all play critical roles in sustaining the bubble during its expansion and in amplifying its unraveling. Once confidence breaks, these entities do not act with malicious intent, but with incentives that drive them toward decisions that ultimately magnify the fragility of the entire system. Central banks are often the first agents in this process. For years, they inject liquidity to stabilize markets, stimulate economies, and prevent downturns. But this constant intervention creates a dependency effect. Markets begin to assume that liquidity will always return, that interest rates will always adjust downward, that monetary policy will always protect asset values. When central banks eventually tighten conditions, even slightly, the system reacts violently. Debt becomes heavier, risk becomes sharper. Every small policy shift echoes through leveraged positions, revealing how deeply global markets rely on artificial support to maintain their balance. Sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors reinforce these pressures. Their mandates require them to chase returns that match or exceed global benchmarks, forcing them into the very assets that accumulate the most risk. When tech surges, they follow. When commodities spike, they allocate more. When the markets behave irrationally, they must participate to avoid falling behind competitors. This creates a feedback loop in which institutional capital pushes valuations to extremes, not because of fundamental belief, but because the structure of the system demands it. And when trouble begins, these same institutions withdraw, liquidity faster than anyone else, accelerating the decline. Large corporations, especially in technology and energy, play their own part. They borrow aggressively during low-rate environments, using cheap debt to expand operations, buy back shares, or acquire competitors. These strategies inflate valuations and signal strength to investors, but they also build enormous leverage into the corporate landscape. When interest rates shift or market conditions tighten, these companies suddenly face the weight of debts that were manageable only under ideal circumstances. The illusion of endless growth evaporates, revealing balance sheets stretched far beyond sustainability. Financial intermediaries, banks, hedge funds, private equity firms add another layer of systemic risk. They construct complex instruments, derivatives, and leverage structures designed to amplify profits under stable conditions. These instruments function smoothly when markets rise, but become explosive when volatility increases. Small fluctuations can trigger margin calls, forced liquidations, and cascading failures that spread across asset classes. The same financial engineering that once created efficiency now becomes a mechanism of contagion. What connects all these agents is not coordination, but convergence. Their incentives overlap. Their strategies mirror one another. Their reactions compound. When the system expands, they push together. When the system weakens, they retreat together. And this synchronized behavior transforms what could have been manageable corrections into large-scale collapses. None of these institutions intend to destabilize the global economy. They are simply responding to the pressures and expectations baked into the structure of modern finance, yet their collective actions shape the path of the collapse as powerfully as any external shock. What makes the collapse cycle so persistent across history is not simply the presence of speculation or the influence of powerful institutions, but the deeper psychological and structural patterns that drive societies to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Even when the details change, new technologies, new markets, new geopolitical tensions, the underlying behaviors remain the same. Human systems evolve, but human nature does not. This is why bubbles reappear in different eras with strikingly similar trajectories, and why the world continually finds itself trapped inside cycles it claims to understand but never manages to escape. The repetition begins with belief. Every generation convinces itself that its innovations, its data, its analytical tools make it more sophisticated than those who came before. Investors trust that modern financial models can predict risk with precision. Policymakers believe they have mastered economic cycles. Corporations assume growth can continue indefinitely if they push hard enough. This collective confidence creates a false sense of control, blinding society to the structural vulnerabilities that quietly expand beneath the optimism. It is the same pattern seen during the railroad boom of the 1800s, the speculative frenzy of the 1920s, the dot-com surge of the 1990s, and the housing mania of the 2000s. Another repeating component is the normalization of excess. At first, people react cautiously to rapid growth. They question the pace, the valuations, the sustainability. But when markets continue rising, skepticism fades and excess becomes accepted as the new normal. Rising prices are no longer viewed as warnings, but as validation. Investors adopt riskier strategies because the system rewards aggression. Institutions push boundaries because restraint costs them influence. Even regulators adapt by redefining what is considered safe. allowing practices that would have been unthinkable in earlier cycles. The echo of past crises also fades surprisingly quickly. As soon as the immediate pain dissipates, societies begin rewriting the narrative, softening the memory of the failures and amplifying the stories of recovery. The lessons learned become diluted, replaced by the idea that future downturns will be easier to manage because the system is smarter now. Yet each cycle grows more complex, more interconnected, and more dependent on fragile mechanisms that magnify risk rather than reduce it. Technology accelerates this repetition instead of preventing it. Algorithms respond to momentum rather than reality. Digital platforms amplify collective emotions faster than traditional markets ever could. Information overload creates the illusion of insight, while obscuring the structural weaknesses hiding in plain sight. The speed at which capital moves today multiplies the impact of every shift in sentiment, turning small changes into global tremors. What ultimately traps the world in this cycle is the universal desire for certainty in an uncertain system. People want growth without limits, innovation without consequences, progress without instability. But these expectations collide with the finite nature of resources, the fragility of global supply chains, and the unavoidable limits of economic expansion. The system strains under the pressure of these contradictions until it reaches a point where it cannot stretch any further, and when it breaks, the shock always feels unprecedented, even though the pattern has been visible for decades. The world reacts with surprise, not because the signals were unclear, but because recognizing them would require accepting that the cycle itself is unavoidable, a truth most people refuse to confront until the consequences are already unfolding around them. As the global financial system teeters on the edge, the inevitable progression towards stage 6 and 7 becomes harder to ignore. The patterns that have repeated for centuries, bubbles inflating beyond sustainable levels, institutional behavior amplifying risk, and psychological cycles of overconfidence and fear converge in ways that few truly anticipate. The transition is not a single moment, but a series of interconnected fractures that together will challenge every assumption held by investors, governments, and everyday participants in the economy. Gold, oil, and technology, the pillars of the current superbubbles, are at the center of this storm, reflecting the stress already spreading through the global network of markets, debt, and policy. Stage 6 will bring a dramatic reassessment of value across multiple asset classes. Investors who believed liquidity was infinite will discover that support mechanisms have limits. Credit will tighten, valuations will correct sharply, and the feedback loop of fear and reaction will accelerate the decline. Even those who predicted the risks will find themselves caught in the sudden volatility, because speed and interconnectivity now amplify every shock. The system's fragility has reached a point where minor disruptions can trigger cascading consequences, making each market, each instrument, each strategic decision a potential accelerant for broader instability. The scale of impact will be unprecedented, not because the mechanisms are new, but because global exposure is larger, faster, and more tightly coupled than ever before. Stage 7, the final phase, will test the resilience of societies, governments, and financial institutions in ways that textbooks cannot fully describe. Economic contractions will ripple into social tension. Political polarization will intensify. Global alliances and trade relationships will face unprecedented stress. In every past cycle, those who ignored the warning signs were blindsided by speed and magnitude. And today, the interconnectedness of the world economy ensures that the consequences of Stage 7 will be felt simultaneously across continents. Yet understanding the mechanics behind this progression is not just about anticipating collapse. It is about recognizing the forces shaping the next era so that informed decisions can be made even as uncertainty escalates. If you've followed this journey to the very end, take a moment to reflect and engage. Leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," to share that you understood the gravity of the cycle. Hit the like button if the analysis opened your eyes to the risks hidden behind the headlines, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel to continue exploring these patterns. There's a video waiting that complements everything discussed here. Click over and continue the journey to see how these historical cycles might shape the near future. Understanding what comes next is not optional. It's essential for anyone seeking to navigate a world where gold, oil, and technology bubbles are now teetering on the edge of stage 6.